Arguably one of the most challenging things about being an educator is managing the behaviors and the conduct of all of these unique little human beings. Now, some of you might have a real knack for it, and it just comes naturally, and if so, good for you, and be confident in that, and I admire you. There also might be some of you who feel like this is an area I could really try some new things with. And rather than giving a litany or a laundry list of all different ways that might fit different little situations, there are plenty of resources out there for that. I tend to be a person that likes to return to fundamentals and let those fundamentals be applied to each unique situation in a pretty authentic way, rather than trying to slap one thing that worked over here and hope it works exactly the same way over here. So maybe before we talk about those fundamentals of things that have been shown to work really consistently in terms of behavioral analysis and response, I think it might be useful to mention or to bring up the idea that it's probably pretty clear already that when a child or an adolescent does something wrong or what we might consider bad, that behavior that's wrong or bad or unwanted, inappropriate, doesn't actually mean that the child themselves is wrong or bad. And I think that's pretty well understood. We all kind of know that. But to make it clear, to make that evident and abundantly present in each moment of corrective authority, it might be useful to reframe unwanted negative behavior of children as being the result or even an expression of one of a couple of things. Maybe habits of adaptation, what I would call habits of adaptation. In other words, they've had to make it through their lives thus far, dealing with certain challenges that they were either equipped for or not, or were helped with or were not helped with. And they have had to make it work as they went. As human beings adapt, they assume different strategies of behavior to try to get them through challenging times. We talked about this with attachment theory, that with each attachment category, there tends to be these predictable behavioral strategies that children with an avoidant attachment, say, might employ or exhibit, versus children with ambivalent attachment may do something different. These strategies of behavior, of adaptation, become habit over time, and they kind of run themselves like habits do. And sometimes that turns into habits of maladaptive or unwanted, inappropriate behavioral responses. And another way behavior might result in a kind of negative way, another way of reframing how we think about negative behavior, is in fact a result of changes in humans' brains as they age. One really essential difference between, say, a very young child's brain and a slightly older child or an adolescent's brain is that over time, the ability to abstractly and creatively think just explodes. As children age, the world gets bigger and more wondrous in a sense, and they can figure it out more deeply, with more of a clarity, with more of an intriguing interest. And that becomes true also for their inner world, who they think they are, and what their personality is, and how people see them, maybe especially that one. And so the way that is expressed as they get used to all this new mental ability is that they test things out. They behaviorally explore what it's like to be themselves. And as creative exploration goes, A lot of it is on that track of straight and narrow, appropriate and wanted behavior. And maybe a disproportionately large amount of it is pretty out there, either inappropriate or even unusual. And behaviors of children and adolescents, as you all know plainly, I'm sure, can range pretty variedly. And so an understanding of that is coming from or being a result of either their ingrained habits of getting by in their lives, maybe even things they were taught implicitly by others, and also a result of creative exploration of who they are. It might be a way of understanding what the behavior means as something different than just this child's being bad. Now, there are other possibilities, of course, about what behavior comes from, what negative or unwanted behavior comes from, and some of them are quite simple. A desire to obtain a wanted consequence. When I do this, something happens that I like, even if other things happen I don't like. A desire to avoid unwanted consequences. When I behave like this, I don't get that thing that I don't like. An example might be if a child doesn't like to go out to recess for some reason. Maybe they feel socially anxious, or they would rather just sit down, I don't know. They know that, and so preventing themselves from going out might mean that they get in trouble on purpose, or kind of unconsciously on purpose. It's just an example. And sometimes behaviors occur because of the sensory consequences. The child likes the way it looks, sounds, tastes, smells, or feels to do this behavior. And it might be worth it to them in the moment, and to receive the consequences of that unwanted behavior. So tracking the behavior back to its origin, to its source, or at least taking a guess at the source, can be helpful in understanding what to do about it and what behavior means. And so I mentioned coming back to fundamentals. In behavioral therapy or behavioral analysis in the educational philosophy, 3 really important concepts are integral in shaping and analyzing and shaping behaviors. That is reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. So this is all stuff you guys know, I'm certain. But again, I think coming back to fundamentals seems to me to be the quickest route to something effective. And not coming back to those principled fundamentals means that we're getting lost on the surface of what those fundamentals give rise to. So maybe just really deep diving in with what these concepts are and how they fit can be helpful to begin to establish routines and habits of dealing with unwanted behaviors of conduct in your class and the unique situations that arise. So, reinforcement. Something that increases the likelihood of the behavior happening in the future. Right? That's what reinforcement means in a technical kind of sense. And when we describe positive reinforcement, the positive in this case means we're introducing something. So we're introducing something wanted, something desirable, something pleasant, some stimulus that's pleasant, to then reinforce the behavior that came before it, to make it more likely to happen again. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, negative in this sense means to remove. We're removing some unwanted consequence, some unwanted, or removing some unpleasant stimulus in order for the behavior to happen again, in order to reinforce the behavior. So we can think of this as reward in a certain sense, because we're delivering a certain set of conditions that's preferable to the child. But in a technical sense, it seems to me to make sense to understand that Positive reinforcement is presenting or introducing a stimulus that reinforces the behavior. Negative reinforcement means we're removing a certain stimulus in order for the behavior to continue, removing an unwanted stimulus. So this is kind of bread and butter, right? You all know about this. But again, it seems to make sense to come back to it because all of the interventions of behavior that you've ever tried probably has something to do with one of these things. And very often we end up getting trapped in the punishment side of things, which isn't bad in and of itself. Punishment is important. But it seems to be that positive reinforcement is by and large the quickest and most effective. And so figuring out ways to put those two elements together, to present something or introduce something that's a wanted stimulus in order to then continue or make the likelihood higher that the behavior will continue in the future. That seems to be the best route to go. It's just what works best. Now on the topic of enforcement, it kind of runs both ways because reinforcement happens whether or not we intend it to. And so what I think of as inadvertent reinforcement can really commonly occur. This is just patterns of behavior become set and ingrained, not because the child resists the correction, but because, in fact, maybe even the correction itself is reinforcing in some small part the behavior that's unwanted. And this is challenging because it's hard to pinpoint what that is. And to be honest, it is a little bit of a threat to one's pride sometimes. But I'm not making them behave this way. It's not my fault that they're behaving this way. And that's true, of course. But it seems worthwhile to examine honestly how we are all participating in interactions with the children so that we're really intentionally reinforcing what we want to have happen and doing our best to move toward the extinction of what we don't want to have happen. And looking at how we play a part in that just kind of makes sense. If we don't look at that, then we're going to be inadvertently reinforcing more and more frequently. So that being said, there's reinforcement on one side and punishment on the other side. Punishment we can simply think of as anything that lowers the likelihood of behaviors reoccurring or occurring more in the future. And in a similar way, we have positive punishment, which sounds kind of odd, but which again means that we're introducing some stimulus, in this case an unwanted one, to make it less likely that the behavior will occur in the future. And we have negative punishment, which again means that we're removing some pleasant or wanted stimulus in the child's life to make it less likely that the behavior will occur again. Okay? So, I mean, that I'm sure makes sense to you, and especially the form of positive punishment. That's probably most often what we see. You did something bad and you get a consequence for it. And we'll talk more about consequence in the next segment of what that actually means when we say that word. But what's technically happening in that kind of case is that we're introducing a positive punishment. We're presenting something that's unwanted or unpleasant so that the hopefully behavior happens less. Now with extinction, that concept I think stands apart because it has to do with ignoring behavior, which is a little bit unique. We aren't addressing the behavior at all. And I would say this can be extremely useful if used intelligently and strategically, because we can't ignore, all unwanted behaviors, of course. But if we get a feel for the child, which is something you all are fairly good at, I'm sure, and maybe using skills of building quality interactions and self-care can help with that. If we know the child well, and we know that we can ignore this or that unwanted negative behavior and it not balloon and get out of control or hurt anybody, we might notice where it could be useful to do so that the behavior eventually extinguishes itself and becomes extinct. it becomes an extinct behavior. What frequently happens, I think, is the ballooning kind of happens just before the extinction happens. That kind of extinction burst is what it's sometimes called. And if you can ride that out, then you'll know that that's a part of the process. But it seems to be a part of a form of negative punishment. The behavior that's being done that's unwanted is being met by removing one's attention from the child. And removing one's attention from a child is very noticed in the child. Attention is, after all, arguably one of the greatest human resources. And removing it from the situation or from the child might be perceived as a kind of punishment in a way for that little instance. And it seems to me that that's kind of how that extinction process works. So these are, again, just kind of the fundamentals of what it might mean to analyze behavior back to its source or its origin, and then respond to it skillfully. So what I'm hoping is try to keep these basics in mind. Keep them in mind and even try to figure out what works for you already and how it works, why it works the way it does, and find those situations that you haven't quite cracked yet. The situations with specific children even that you don't feel really confident with yet. And try to build from the ground up, maybe noticing chances for positive reinforcement first, since they tend to be the most effective. And try to use those in unique ways that fit the distinct circumstance and the unique situation that you find yourself in with each child or with each class that you might come in contact with.